Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books out loud while stoned. Today we're going to pick up at part 3 of Little Blue Book number 61, titled What is Religion? Written by Leo Tolstoy. Oops. And we left off, I believe, chapter 9 is what we're going to begin today. So, here we go. In chapter 6 of the book of Genesis, there is a profound passage in which the author says that God, before the flood, having seen that the Spirit he had given to men, that they might serve him, was used by them only to serve their own desires, became so angry with men that he repented of having created them, and before entirely destroying them, decided to shorten the life of a man to 120 years. And the very thing that, according to the Bible, then so provoked God's anger that it caused him to shorten man's life, is again going on among the people of our Christian world. Reason is the power which enables men to define their relation to the universe, and as all men stand in one and the same relation to the universe, it follows that religion, which is the elucidation of that relation, unites men, and union among men affords them the highest attainable welfare, both physical and spiritual. Complete union with the highest and most perfect reason, and therefore complete welfare, is the ideal towards which humanity strives. And all religions unite people by supplying identical answers to all men of any given society when they ask what the universe is and what its inhabitants are. And by uniting them, it brings them nearer to the attainment of welfare. But when reason, diverging from its natural function, that of determining man's relation to God, and what his activity should be, conformably to that relation, is used in the service of the flesh and for angry strife with other men and other fellow creatures, and when it is even used to justify this evil life so contrary to man's nature and to the purpose for which he is intended, then those terrible calamities result, under which the majority of men are now suffering, and a state is reached that makes any reason to be reasonable and good life seem almost impossible. Make any return to a reasonable and good life seem impossible. Pagans unite by the crudest religious teaching are far nearer the recognition of truth than the pseudo-Christian nations of our day, who live without any religion, and among whom the most advanced people are themselves convinced and suggest to others that religion is unnecessary, and that it is much better to live without any. Among the pagans, men may be found who, recognizing the inconsistency of their faith with their increasing knowledge and with the demands of their reason, produce or adopt a new religion, more in accord with the spiritual condition of their nation, and acceptable to their compatriots and co-believers. But men of our world, some of whom regard religion as an instrument wherewith to keep common folk in subjection, while others consider all religion absurd, and yet others, the great majority of the nation, while living under the hypnotism of a gross deception, think they possess true religion, become impervious to any forward movement, and incapable of any approach towards truth. Proud of their improvements in things that regard the bodily life, as well as of their refined idle reasonings, in which they aim not only at justifying themselves, but also at proving their superiority to any other people, any age or history, they petrify in ignorance and immorality, while feeling fully assured that they stand on an elevation never before reached by humanity, and that every step forward along the path of ignorance and immorality raises them to yet greater heights of enlightenment and progress. End of chapter 9. Hydrate. This cottonmouth sucks. Chapter 10. Hold on. You flip page. There we go. Okay, chapter 10. Man naturally wishes to bring his bodily or physical and his rational, spiritual, activity into conformity. He cannot be at peace until in one way or another, let me see this, make sure I'm right page. Felt like there's, nope. In one way or another, he has reached that conformity. But it is attainable in two different ways. One way is for man to decide by the use of his reason on the necessity or desirability of a certain action or actions, and then to behave accordingly. The other way is for a man to commit actions under the influence of his feelings, and then to invent intellectual explanations or justifications for what he has done. The first method of conforming one's actions with one's reason is characteristic of men who have some religion, and on the basis of its precepts decide what they ought and what they ought not to do. The second method is generally characteristic of men who are not religious, and have no general standard by which to judge the quality of actions, and who therefore always set up a conformity between their reason and their actions, not by subjecting the latter to their reason, but, after acting under the sway of feeling, by using reason to justify what they have done. A religious man, knowing what is good and what is bad in his own activity and in that of others, and knowing also why one thing is good and another is bad, when he sees a contradiction between the demands of reason and his own or other men's actions, will employ the whole force of his reason to find means to destroy these contradictions, by learning how best to bring his actions into agreement with the demands of his reason. But a man without religion, who has no standard whereby to judge the quality of actions apart from the pleasure they afford him, yielding to the sway of his feelings, which are most various and often contradictory, involuntarily falls into contradictions, and, having fallen into contradictions, tries to solve or hide them by arguments more or less elaborate and clever, but always untruthful. And therefore, while the reasoning of truly religious men is always simple, direct, and truthful, the mental activity of men who lack religion becomes particularly subtle, complex, and insincere. I will take the most common example, that of a man who is addicted to vice, that is not chaste, not faithful to his wife, or, being unmarried, indulges in vice. If he is a religious man, he knows that this is wrong, and all the efforts of his reason are directed to finding means to free himself from his vice. Avoiding intercourse with adulterers and adulteresses, increasing the amount of his work, arranging a strict life for himself, not allowing himself to look on a woman as on an object of desire, and so forth. And all this is very simple, and everyone can understand it. But if the incontinent man is not religious, he at once begins to devise all sorts of explanations to prove that falling in love with women is very good, and then we get all sorts of most complex, cunning, and subtle considerations about the affinity of souls, about beauty, about the freedom of love, etc. And the more these spread, the more they darken the question and hide the essential truth. Among those who lack religion, the same thing happens in all spheres of activity and of thought. To hide underlying contradictions, complex, subtle disquietness are piled up, which, by filling the mind with all sorts of unnecessary rubbish, divert man's attention from what is important and essential, and make it possible for them to petrify in the deceit in which, without noticing it, the people of our world are living. Men loved the darkness rather than the light, for their works were evil, says the gospel. For every one that doeth ill hateth the light, and cometh not to the light, lest his works should be reproved. And therefore the men of our world, having in consequence of their lack of religion, arranged a most cruel, animal, and immoral life, have also brought their complex, subtle, unprofitable activity of mind, hiding the evil of this kind of life to such a degree of unnecessarily intricacy and confusion that the majority of them, have quite lost the capacity to distinguish good from evil, or what is false from what is true. There is not a single question the men of our world can approach directly and simply. All questions, economic, national, political, whether home or foreign, diplomatic or scientific, not to mention questions of philosophy and religion, are presented so artificially and incorrectly, and are swathed in such thick shrouds of complex, unnecessary disputations, such subtle perversions of meanings and words, such sophistries and disputes, that our arguments about such questions revolve on one spot, connecting with nothing, and like driving wheels without a connecting strap, affect nothing, except the one object for which they were produced, to hide from oneself and from others the evil in which men live and evil they commit. End of chapter 10. Hydrate. Chapter 11. In every domain of what is now called science, one and the same feature is encountered, baffling the mental efforts men direct to the investigation of various domains of knowledge. This feature is that all these scientific investigations evade the essential question calling for an answer, and examine side issues, the investigation of which brings one to no definite result, but becomes more intricate the further one advances. Nor can this be otherwise in a science which selects the objects of its investigation haphazard, and not according to the demands of a religious conception of life, defining what should be studied and why, what first and what afterwards. For instance, in the now fashionable subjects of sociology and political economy, it would seem that there is really only one question. How is it, and why is it, that some people do nothing while others are working for them? If there is another question, why do people work separately, hindering one another and not together in common as would be more profitable? That question is inclined to the first, for where there no inequality, there would be no strife. It would seem that there ought to be only that one question, but science does not even think of propounding and replying to it, but commences its discussions from afar off, and conducts them so that its conclusions can never either solve or assist the solution of the fundamental problem. Discussions are started concerning what used to be and what now is, and the past and the present are regarded as something as unalterable as the course of the stars in the heavens, and abstract conceptions are devised, value, capital, profit, and interest, and a complex play of wits results, which has now already continued for 100 years among the disputants. In reality, the question can be settled very easily and simply. Its solution lies in the fact that, as all men are brothers and equals, each should act towards others as he wishes them to act towards him, and therefore the whole matter depends on the destruction of a false religious law, and the restoration of the true religious law. The advanced people of Christendom, however, not only refuse to accept that solution, but, on the contrary, try to hide from men the possibility of such a solution, and therefore devote themselves to the idle play of intelligence which they can call science. The same thing takes place in the domain of jurisprudence. There would seem to be only one essential question. How is it that there are men who allow themselves to perpetuate violence on others, to fleece them, confine them, execute them, send them to wars, and so on? The solution of that question is very simple, if it be examined from the only point of view suitable to the subject, the religious. From a religious point of view, man must not and should not subject his neighbor to violence, and therefore only one thing is needful for the solution of the question, namely, to destroy all superstitions and sophistries which allow of violence, and to instill into men religious principles clearly excluding the possibility of violence. But the advanced men, instead of doing this, devote all their wits to the task of hiding from others the possibility and necessity of such a solution. They write mountains of books about all sorts of laws, civil, criminal, police, church, commercial, etc., and expound and dispute about these, fully assured that they are doing something not only useful, but very important. To the question, why, among men who are naturally equal, may some judge, coerce, fleece, and execute others? They give no reply, and do not even acknowledge the existence of such a question. According to their doctrine, this violence is not committed by men, but by some abstraction called the state. And similarly, in all realms of knowledge, the learned men of today evade and are silent about the essential questions and hide the underlying contradictions. In the realm of history, the only essential question is how the workers, who form 999 1,000th of the whole of humanity, lived. To this question we get nothing like an answer. The question is ignored, while whole mountains of books are written by historians of one school to tell of the stomach aches of Louis the Sixth, the horrors committed by Elizabeth of England, or Ivan the Terrible of Russia, or who were their ministers, and of what verses and comedies were written by literary men to amuse these kings and their mistresses and ministers. Meanwhile, the historians of another school tell us in what sort of country a people lived, what they ate, what they sold, what clothes they wore, and in general about things that could have no influence on the people's true life, but were results of their religion, which the historians of this class imagine to be itself a result of the food the people ate and the clothes they wore. Yet an answer to the question, how did the workers live, cannot be given till we acknowledge religion to be the essential condition of a people's life. And the reply is, therefore, to be found in the study of the religions believed in by the nations, for these brought them to the position in which they lived. In the study of natural history, one would think there was little need to darken men's common sense. But even here, following the... These pages are thin. Following the bent of mind which contemporary science has adopted, instead of giving the most natural replies to the questions, what is the world of living things, plants and animals, and how is it subdivided, an idle, confused, and perfectly useless chatter is started, directed chiefly against the biblical accounts of the creation of the world, as to how organisms came into existence, which, really, one neither needs to know nor can know. For this origin, however we may explain it, always remains hidden from us in endless time and space. But on this theme, theories and refutations and supplementary theories are invented, filling millions of books. The unexpected result arrived at being that the law of life which men should obey is the struggle for existence. More than that, the applied sciences, such as technology and medicine, in consequence of the absence of any guidance from religious principle, inevitably diverge from their reasonable purpose and take a false direction. Thus, technology is directed not to lightening the toil of the people, but to achieving improvements needed only by the rich, and which therefore will yet more widely separate the rich from the poor, the masters from their slaves. If some advantage from these inventions and improvements, some crumbs, do reach the working class, this is not at all because they were intended for the people, but only because by their nature they could not be kept from the people. It is the same with medical science, which has advanced in its false direction till it has reached a stage at which only the rich man commanded it, while from their manner of life and their poverty, and as a result of the fact that the questions relating to the amelioration of the life of the poor have been neglected, the mass of the people can only avail themselves of it under conditions that most clearly show how medical science has diverged from its true purpose. But this avoidance and pervasion of essential questions is most strikingly seen in what is now called philosophy. There would seem to be one essential question for philosophy to answer: what must I do? And in the philosophy of the Christian nations, answers to this question, though combined with very much that is unnecessary and confused, as in the case of Spinoza, Kant, in the Critique of Practical Reason, Schopenhauer, and particularly Rousseau, have at any rate been given, but latterly, since Hegel, who taught that whatever exists is reasonable, the question, what must we do, has been pushed into the background, and philosophy directs its whole attention to the investigation of things as they are, and to making them fit into a prearranged theory. That was the first downward step. The next step, leading human thought to a yet lower level, was the acknowledgement of the law of the struggle for existence as fundamental merely because that struggle can be observed among plants and animals. Under the influence of that theory, it is assumed that the destruction of the weakest is a law which should not be checked. Finally came the third step, when the semi-sane Nietzsche's puerile efforts at originality, which do not even present anything complete or coherent, but are as it were immoral, offhand jottings of utter baseless thoughts, were accepted by advanced people as the last word of philosophic science, in reply to the question, what must we do? The advice is new, plainly offered. Live as you please, paying no attention to the lives of others. If anyone doubted the terrible state of stupefaction and bestiality to which our Christian humanity has descended, without speaking of the crimes recently committed in South Africa and China, and which were defended by priests and accepted as achievements by all the great ones of the earth, the extraordinary success of the writings of Nietzsche would alone suffice to supply an unanswerable proof. Some disjointed writings, aiming most obtrusively at effect, appear, written by a man suffering from megalomania, a bold but limited and abnormal German. Neither in talent nor by their validity have these writings any claim on public attention. In the days of Kant, Leibniz, or Hume, or even 50 years ago, such writings, far from attracting attention, could not even have appeared. But in our days, all the so-called educated classes of humanity are delighted with the ravings of Mr. Nietzsche. They dispute about him and explain him, and innumerable copies of his works are printed in all languages. Turgenev humorously says that there are such things as reversed platitudes, and that they are often used by people lacking in talent, but desirous of attracting attention. Everyone knows, for instance, that water is wet, but suddenly someone seriously asserts that water is dry. Not ice, but water is dry. And such an opinion is confidently expressed, attracts attention. In the same way, the whole world knows that virtue consists in subduing one's passions and in self-renunciation. This is known not by Christians only, with whom Nietzsche imagines he is frightening, but it is an eternal and supreme law which all humanity has recognized, in Brahmanism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and in ancient Persian religion. And suddenly, a man appears who announces his discovery that self-renunciation, mindless meekness, love, that all these are vices which are ruining humanity. He refers to Christianity, forgetting all the other religions. It is comprehensible that such an assertion should at first perplex people, but after thinking a little, and failing to find in his writings any proofs supporting this vague assertion, every rational man ought to reject such books and only be surprised that nowadays there is no nonsense too errant to find a publisher. With the works of Nietzsche, that course has not been adopted. The majority of the pseudo-enlightened people seriously discuss the theory of superhumanity and acclaim its author as the great philosopher, a successor to Descartes, Leibniz, and Kant. And all this has happened because the majority of pseudo-enlightened men of today dislike anything reminding them of virtue or of its chief basis, self-renunciation and love. Things that restrain and condemn the animal life they lead, and they gladly welcome a doctrine of egotism and cruelty, however poorly, unintelligibly, and disjointedly expressed, which justifies the system of founding one's own happiness and greatness upon the lives of others, the system in which they live. That is the end of chapter 11. No, chapter 10. No, chapter 11. We're starting chapter 12. Woo. Okay, let's see. How many pages do we have left? Oh, quite a few. I think we'll stop here and we'll do a part 4 because there's enough pages here to do a part 4. I believe. Yep. Let's see. 40. Yep, there's about 20 more pages. So, this will be the end of part 3. We'll leave off at the end of chapter 11. And in part 4, we'll start chapter 12. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in part 4.